Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about work-based sexual harassment. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Ryan Kane. Ryan uses he, him pronouns and is the Assistant Vice President for Equity and Access in the Office of Organizational Development and Human Resources at Valencia College. Since arriving at Valencia in 2015, Ryan has served as the Equal Opportunity Officer and Title IX Coordinator, as well as AVP for Organizational Development and Inclusion. In his current role, Ryan leads, among other teams, the Equal Opportunity Office that addresses all complaints of harassment and discrimination for employees and students at the college. Ryan earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and a Master of Arts degree in Counseling Psychology. So Ryan, thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you, Emily. I'm really pleased to be here.
And I also have Danielle Jeter. Danielle Jeter uses she, her pronouns, and is an experienced sexual harassment educator and human resources professional in the Central Florida community. She has a passion for hosting conversations surrounding harassment, sexual assault, boundaries, and more in an effort to prevent violence and promote safe professional spaces. So thank you so much, Danielle, for being here as well.
No problem. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have this long overdue discussion, to be honest, because we talk a lot about the sexual violence umbrella on this podcast, and under it includes things like rape, sexual assault, fondling and groping, sexual abuse, and it also includes sexual harassment. And there are also many different types of sexual harassment, like school-based and street harassment and things like that. But today we are going to be talking about specifically work-based sexual harassment. We'll also be talking about certain workspaces that put people at risk for harassment, barriers survivors face when reporting or seeking out help, and ways we can all help change the culture that perpetuates sexual harassment. So with that, I'd like to start off, as I normally do, with some definitions. So how would you define work-based sexual harassment?
Well, workplace sexual harassment would be any unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual acts, or any other conduct of a sexual nature. That's pretty much the Webster's dictionary version of what sexual harassment is. And of course, there's different levels of sexual harassment. There's different types of sexual harassment, and I don't want to, take all of the time. Ryan, if you want to jump in, I don't know if you want to express anything, in more depth. I'm sure we're going to get into that, but
Thank you, Danielle. I agree. I think the key element that we talk about with our employees a lot is that it has to be significant enough to affect the work environment or to create a hostile work environment. And so there is a threshold there. And it's important to discuss that. It's also important to say that for behaviors that don't quite meet that threshold, they're still problematic. They just might not meet the legal or industry definition of sexual harassment.
Definitely. I think that's super important. I'm really glad that you both brought that up, because I think a lot of times that is really key to know that, these things are still not okay, even if they, may not be at the threshold. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we can still do if someone is experiencing harassment, but maybe may not be able to go about it through HR or things like that. What are their options? But Danielle, you mentioned that there's different types of it as well. So I'd like to ask, what is quid pro quo and what is hostile work environment?
Well, quid pro quo is this for that, a favor for a favor. And when we're looking at that from a workplace perspective, it's when someone with more power requests some type of sexual favor in exchange for, an employment benefit of some sort. That would be what quid pro quo is. And then when we look at the hostile work environment, it's really anything that a harasser can do that can make a person feel uncomfortable just by being in the same place as him or her. Right. That could be somebody who's witnessing something. That person has now been exposed to, what some people may call bystander or third party hostile work environment. Or you may just create an environment between two people that makes a person feel uncomfortable being around that person or being in that environment. So that would be, how I would describe those two forms of sexual harassment in the workplace.
Yeah. And thank you so much. I think that that's a great definition. And again, I think a lot of times we do think of like the classic quid pro quo when it comes to sexual harassment, but obviously there's so many other elements here too, as far as the hostile work environment. Ryan, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on those definitions and add anything.
I don't think there's anything to add. I think Danielle did a great job sharing those two differences. But the quid pro quo, surprisingly, we still see in the workplace. You would think that is so outdated that people would never do that anymore. But that is, it's prevalent more so than I think most people would think.
Absolutely. And it can look a few different ways, right? It could be like for a glowing letter of recommendation for a certain promotion, something like that, right? And you brought up the fact that it's still going on, and people may not realize that. So I wanted to lean in on some other myths or common myths that we have, these ideas that we may hold to be true, but actually are not true when it comes to sexual harassment that maybe you would like to address.
Sure. I think one that Danielle spoke to earlier was about the third-party sexual harassment. Individuals often will have a belief or a myth that unless you are the target of the sexual harassment, you cannot be impacted by the behavior or that you can't file a complaint. But if there are two individuals in a work setting and they're talking about a consensual conversation about sexual activity, something along those lines, and that someone in a proximity at work is being subject to that constantly, that could create that hostile environment that Danielle talked about for that other person. And so I think that's a significant myth that exists. I think another one that I would say is that people are inherently lying about their experiences to get something, to get away with something, for example. Oftentimes we see these types of claims come up among disciplinary conversations where someone is potentially being disciplined. And that's when the victim or complainant brings this forward. And so oftentimes it is believed to say, well, that person's only bringing this up to get out of something or to get away with something or to get a promotion or to get more money as a sense of leverage. But in fact, that is a myth. There is no evidence to suggest that individuals who've been subject to sexual harassment are lying about that any more than any other crime that would be committed of any nature.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Ryan. That is something that we talk about a lot in the work that we do, especially with survivors of sexual assault too. Essentially there's this inflated idea that survivors are lying. And again, like you mentioned, the stats show that you are no more likely to be falsely accused for rape as you are for other felonies like murder and things like that. But there's this inflated idea that survivors are lying, and absolutely not the case. That's why we should start by believing it's actually a really huge reason why people do not come forward and share their experiences, because they're afraid that people won't believe them. So yeah, I really appreciate you breaking down those myths. And also that myth that that hostile work environment isn't affecting you, even if like it's a consensual conversation. That's such an important piece to it that I didn't think about. Do you hear a lot about where it's like it comes with the job, like a certain type of job is just like, oh, harassment's just normal for example, a bartender or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that people go into an environment and they feel like they have to sort of adopt whatever the practices are, and sometimes they're not always favorable. I can definitely share, experiences in what I do on a day-to-day basis, and say that, there are environments where people, they laugh and they joke about things that, could seemingly be hurtful to other people. From a sexual harassment perspective, laughing at, a woman's physique, or, a way a man carries themselves. And, all of that, we forget that just putting people into a specific category is also a form of sexual harassment. Harassing men for, one particular thing or another, or vice versa, doing it to a woman. So yes, there are environments, bartenders, areas typically where we have, similar minded or cultures together, and you have someone who's not a part of that culture who comes in and may not be able to understand what's being said, the dialogue that's being used, the joke that's being told, but it creates a hostile work environment. So a lot of times, what you just said was absolutely true. That's a myth that I think I forgot for a moment there, but yes, that's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like to share, and I appreciate you sharing, Danielle. In my training on sexual harassment that I give, I like to say that no job description says must endure harassment. That's absolutely not okay.
Right.
So yeah, I appreciate you kind of breaking down that myth too. I don't know. Also, I feel like, is there a myth that, only women face harassment?
I would say so, that is a myth. I think that the counter to that is also that women cannot sexually harass as a result. So only men can sexually harass is the other myth. And so, as we know, sexual harassment can occur among any gender combination, and to only view it in one lens is a disservice to the people that we're trying to educate, but also the people who are reporting those as well. I think one of the other things that, Danielle, when you were speaking, it brought to mind is that the myth that because nobody spoke up means that everybody was okay with the conversation. And we see that as almost an affirmation of no active consent or passivity means that we were all okay with it. So therefore, it could not be sexual harassment. It could not be a hostile environment because somebody needed to have said something. Whereas the flip is, it is on the ownership of the employees to really kind of get that consent to determine, are we okay about talking about this at work? Chances are you probably shouldn't be talking about it at work from an HR perspective. But if you choose to, someone sitting there in silence or choosing to get up every time the conversation starts should be a real indicator that that is something that they're probably not comfortable being part of.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, Ryan. I think a lot of times the onus, once again, the onus should be on the individual making the comments and making that environment. And absolutely, just because someone, an absence of a no doesn't equal a yes, right? I think that that's super key. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing up that as well. Going off of that, are there, ideas that for example, you were talking about certain topics. So for example, are comments about someone's gender identity or sexual identity, are those considered sexual harassment as well? Or are those considered something else?
I think the answer to that is they could be. There's very few absolutes, as probably I would assume Danielle would also comment on, that this is definitely or this is definitely not, which is some of the challenge associated with addressing this type of behavior, because you do have to take the context in mind and the impact on the individual. The myth that the intention matters. No, it's really the impact that matters. And so we have to take all of those things in mind when we are looking at it. And so I think to say that it definitely could be or couldn't be, it's still bringing it into the ballpark, so to speak, or it's on the target that we've got to address it. We've got to be able to respond and help the person who's affected by that.
And of course, when we're looking at this, we have to understand that sexual harassment is very individualized, right? So there are some people who can accept, more, can tolerate more than others. And for some, a particular action may be considered sexual harassment. For another one, they're perfectly okay with it. And again, the definition of sexual harassment is unwelcomed. But of course, we have to keep in mind in a workplace that two things that we want to sort of center ourselves around is professionalism and respect. So, the actions that we're putting out, that other people can see us do, does it fall in that category of being professional? And are you being respectful to yourself as well as to your coworkers? So those are some things to think about as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, it goes back to exactly what you both were basically saying, which is the impact matters, not the intention. And then just absolutely like the consent at the end of the day, and just everyone deserves to feel safe in their place of work. You also mentioned, Danielle, you were bringing up this idea that there's certain types of work environments that may be more at risk of harassment. I don't know if any of you would like to expand on what those types of like risk factors could be.
Sure. I would say that some of the environments that may be a little bit more prone to sexual harassment would be environments that are that have a high focus on customer satisfaction. So if you have, say the transportation industry, that might be an industry where, we're like, we got to get the people on the bus. So you may have to, it's the perception that you have to endure whatever happens because we got to get these customers to where they want to go. You said earlier, being in a bar, right? Oh, no. They're just here for the night. So you have to accept this behavior, right? Because they're going to go home tomorrow and, this is kind of what you signed up for. We also want to look at, more isolated workspaces, right? If you work in, by yourself, working alone, that it may be an opportunity for some of these things to happen because there's no witnesses, there's no one there. So we want to sort of guard ourselves in those type of environments. I would say also areas or employers that have a centralized culture or language that they use. So if you have someone who comes in who may not speak the language as well, they may be a little bit more at risk because they're coming in sort of as an outsider. And I hate to say it that way, but sometimes that's how it's perceived. They don't quite understand. And so they may, that person who does not speak, as much, whatever the prominent language may be, or speak it as well as someone else, may have, again, that language barrier that puts them into a particular position. And maybe even an area where there's high value employees. So in those environments, like, oh no, this person is, valued employer. Everyone loves them. So no one wants to look at that person as, particularly doing wrong, so they can get away with things that, maybe others couldn't. So those are some things to think about in terms of having that high risk harassment environment.
Yeah, I think Danielle pointed out a number of those, and I would agree with what she had highlighted. I think the additional thoughts that I would have are, and it's to piggyback off of what Danielle shared, is really a homogeneous type of environment, or perceived homogeneous type of environment, where you tend to get some groupthink and you get some expectations of like-mindedness, that therefore those barriers or those expectations for whatever reason would not be seen as necessary. So let's just talk about, everybody's going to talk about this because we all agree, or we assume that we all agree on this. So let's just talk this way, or talk about these topics. And the environments that don't have clear expectations and guidelines and shared language about these topics, that it's not permeating, not just from an HR department to say you can't do these things, but this is part of the culture. If this is not talked about, discussed at all levels of the company or organization, there is a greater propensity for people to engage in the behaviors that are just not what is expected of them or should be expected of them.
That is such a really good point as far as, that groupthink environment too, just assuming, again, this lack of consent. And then Danielle, yeah, you brought up so many good points, including like the hospitality industry, right? And we're in Central Florida and people are listening to this all over, but the hospitality industry is a big deal here. This idea of like, you have to please the client, please the customer, and that could definitely put people at risk for, harassment. So yeah, I appreciate you all kind of talking about these different risk factors to keep in mind. In addition to that, you talked a little bit about some barriers, right, that people may face. So when it comes to sexual harassment, I've heard of this silent culture, essentially people not feeling safe enough to report or ask for help if they're experiencing harassment. One of those reasons could be, of course, fear of being believed, like we mentioned earlier. But what are some of those specific barriers people may face when it comes to disclosing or reporting sexual harassment?
I think that there are so many that probably Danielle and I could go for the rest of the time naming them back and forth. I think one of the most pressing one that comes to mind is the fear of retaliation. What is going to happen to me, to my job, to my career, to my reputation if I bring something forward? So therefore, I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to endure it, or maybe even I'm just going to quit. I'm not going to work here anymore, or I'm going to continue to work, but I'm really going to quit, but still work here and just do the minimum at most. When you think about it, there is a real perception that when you share this, the spotlight goes on that person, the reporting party or the complainant, that there is this belief or this fear that everyone will therefore know about their business, that this will now be publicized in the newsletter, for example. This will be the topic of water cooler conversation. And if companies and organizations don't clearly address that perception and to address the retaliation, that is going to be a barrier that for many people there, it's going to be insurmountable. But to be the fear of the person with the spotlight, to be isolated as a result, nobody may want to talk to this person, or the fear of that, even if that's not true, because they were the person who, to Danielle's point, to said that this beloved employee, this star employee did this. And so how dare you say that? And that's why it's really important for companies, organizations, and everyone in those organizations to say that that's not okay, that it is our collective responsibility, because if we are treating our employees like that, who do come forward and take that brave step, there's a cultural issue at the organization if they're not supporting them.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. Those fear of retaliation or just like fear of rocking the boat, as you were mentioning, as, if people are feeling like that could be a consequence to coming forward, they might think like, I'm not sure if I want to risk that. Right. Danielle, are there any other like specific barriers that you wanted to point out?
Ryan did a great job of going through those. I would say maybe a little bit more personal, maybe being embarrassed. I think that's a big one too. People don't want to share what happened. They just want it to go away. They're embarrassed. That whether they care about getting someone else into trouble, which were some of the things that Ryan already said, it's more about just their personal belief. Like, I can't allow this information, to get out. So really, I think Ryan did a great job explaining that one. So that's really the only one I would have probably brought up, because I think he hit most of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I wonder though, I always like to bring up intersectionality, like coming from an intersectional lens of like mixing identities here. Are there specific barriers that those part of like marginalized communities may face?
I think it goes back to that basic premise, which is fear. And I would say even in that particular instance, retaliation would be the biggest one. They're afraid, what's going to happen to me if I were to share this? I'm already in a particular position. Nothing good can come of this, or they're fearing being blamed for it. again, I'm not the valued employee, so they're going to blame me. It's easier to blame me. So those would be the things that I would say would really present itself in that marginalized community.
That's such a good point, Danielle. People are probably already feeling, that they're not valued maybe at work, and just maybe people won't take them seriously. Ryan, you had a reaction.
I think I agree with Danielle. For many individuals in the workplace who identify as LGBTQ, there's definitely even more of a hesitancy to come forward for a number of reasons that, again, we could talk about for a long time. But some may be because they're not out at work. And so by doing so and by talking about this, their own sexual orientation or sexual identity or gender identity comes into play. And so that this is not something that they would choose to want to, again, bring that spotlight on. And I also think, although men are typically not a marginalized group, but to say that men, there's a stigma associated with a male who is a complainant. You have that old school kind of bro culture to say, you think back to how the media has portrayed this, like an executive who's a female who is sexually harassing a male, where you see that in the media, where you see it in film and TV is, well, why wouldn't you be excited about that? Why wouldn't you go for that to the male? Because this is a woman coming on to him in that example. And so for a male oftentimes to say, because that was not wanted, I was not interested, that was offensive, that was a hostile work environment, is a significant barrier for a lot of men to share. In the same way that if it's a male sexually harassing another male, you have the stigma and oftentimes homophobia that goes along with that. And so to not share that out of perception of what will people think of me, my own sexual identity or sexual orientation, if I bring this forth. So there, again, in addition to all the barriers we talk about, they're even more pronounced in certain communities and certain identities.
I'm so glad that you brought up men and also the LGBTQ plus community. I think it really is kind of showing how, when we talk about the umbrella of sexual violence, how these are all kind of connected, because it really just sounds like rape culture, to be honest, this idea of, why we wouldn't believe survivors that are male identified, like, well, didn't you want it? Why wouldn't you want to with a woman, and all those different things, those specific barriers that men face too, which is probably why we're seeing not as many come forward when they do experience sexual harassment. So I really appreciate you both kind of highlighting those specific barriers. I also kind of wanted to shift a little bit about the topic here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the anti-harassment laws or policies. What are some of those limitations to these laws or policies, and what barriers do HR personnel face when it comes to helping survivors?
I think with regards to the laws, that as we know that there's no consensus on things the exact same way, that apply the laws in the exact same way, which leaves HR professionals a lot of times to try and figure out which laws do I need to be following? If this defines this way, but this law says it a little bit differently, what do I do? A lot of the laws also don't speak to the intersectionalities, Emily, that you were talking about before, which are gender identity and sexual orientation. So does sexual harassment include those identities? Can someone be sexually harassed? There's been a lot of interpretation of the law to support, yes, that if you are harassing somebody because of their sexual orientation, then that is a form of sexual harassment. But the laws are not as explicit in that. It also does not speak to individuals who are non-binary in terms of gender. And so what does that mean? What does the law say? What is implied? What is misapplied based on that? And for me, the challenge is that although these laws exist and they need to exist, they still don't eliminate those barriers that we talked about. Despite those laws existing, those barriers are in many ways much more strong to prevent people from wanting to come forward, despite the fact that the law says that they can and the law says they'll be protected. But the application of that for a lot is to say, yes, that's all well and good, but I'm still not going to say anything because of the things we shared about earlier.
Yeah, I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So with that, if someone is experiencing harassment, and it isn't seen as a policy problem. What can they do? What are their options? And how can someone still help them even if, with these limitations that we mentioned? What other options do they have?
Well, I would say find a strength partner. Find somebody that you can confide in and begin to speak up and speak out. If need be, get counsel. I've had the lovely opportunity of meeting a few of the VSC staff members, and I would say that's a great place for someone to go, right, to get some help. EAP would be great. Most employers have an EAP department that they can, or EAP help desk number that they can reach out to get some type of assistance. But ideally, I think that a person who feels comfortable enough should just use their voice if they're able to, and just tell a person who's harassing them to stop. We definitely encourage that in training to say, find your voice, speak up and speak out if you can. And it may be difficult to do, but more often than not, being able to speak up is going to yield the greatest reward. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of Me Too, right? Where one person kind of starts and then like more people feel more safe to say like, hey, that's happened to me too. And it kind of encourages other people to speak up to help, prevent this and things like that. Ryan, did you have anything that you wanted to share as far as different options that survivors could have?
I love the idea that Danielle shared, which is to find a supportive person. That can be an ally at work that you can ask to sit with you when you go and talk to somebody, either your supervisor or to an HR department or an equivalent department to report that. We also have to remember that supervisors cannot turn their heads. If they knew or should have known that something was going on, they have accountability and responsibility. And so speaking to somebody's supervisor is a first step, and many times that is an important step to do. I would also suggest for people who are not yet ready to make that formal complaint, to get as much information as possible and to be an informed employee about the process. So to call an HR department to say, can we talk about hypothetically this policy so I can understand what this is going to look like? A lot of time individuals will be very hesitant to say what happened, because then that sets a chain of events that they feel that they can't control anymore. And so that they may not want to share that, because then what happens? Who's going to find out? Is this person going to get fired? I don't want them to get fired. I just want them to stop doing X. So to talk to an HR department and say, can you help me understand the process? What if someone came in forth and shared this type of information? What would their options be? What's available? What's private? What's not? So that they can be informed about what feels right for them when they're ready to take those next steps.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that too, because there's a ton of information out there. So it's nice to go to your HR person, to your EEO officer, to your supervisors. But sometimes people are afraid that person may not be in their corner. So just being more informed. Most companies, agencies will have a pamphlet that talks about those things. Get a pamphlet and read it. I'm not saying be a Google expert, but definitely go out, Google some things, get an understanding, go to the EEOC website. And then what we tell all of our people who experience this, I would strongly suggest writing out what happens. Keeping a diary, a log of what's going on for your own mental state as well as for your protection. So those are some additional things I wanted to add.
I love that you both kind of shared all these different additional options that survivors have. And you brought up something too, Ryan, this idea of this fear that they'll lose control of, if they do report it. I don't want to get this person fired. And basically, I wanted to ask, why is it important that survivors choose what is best for them as far as their options? Why is this important as far as their healing journey, or, just to help and be survivor focused, that they're the ones kind of choosing what's best for them.
I think, Emily, as you talked earlier about the similarities between rape culture, and I'm clearly not equating sexual harassment in the workplace to a sexual assault, but the foundation of the lack of power, the lack of control, the individual did not ask to be sexually harassed. This is not something that when they went to work that day, that they said, I hope that I'm sexually harassed at work or when I choose to work there. And so there was already that loss of power and control. And so it's really important to be able to give as much or to empower that individual as much as we can. That also prevents them from telling their story over and over again. As we know with sexual assault survivors, that is a barrier, that is an impact on individuals. It can re-traumatize people. The same elements exist for sexual harassment, that individuals don't want to have to go and talk to their supervisor, then talk to HR, and then talk to an EO officer, and then potentially somebody else. They just want oftentimes the behavior to stop. And in doing so, are we creating systemic barriers to prevent people from doing it by requiring multiple steps and multiple times to talk? And I hope that companies and organizations will take a look at their own processes to minimize those interactions and those requests to tell their story over and over.
Such an amazing point too. Yeah, this idea that you have to rehash it over and over again too, that re-traumatization. So really essentially being like from a survivor focused lens to understand, like put them in their shoes. And you mentioned also those barriers once again. So what would you say, you Danielle or you Ryan, what would you say to a survivor who feels stuck?
I think for me I would acknowledge that person is stuck and not try and force them to be unstuck. They need to be ready when they're ready, and that their timeline may be different than what I would expect my timeline would be if I was in their situation. And that's really important, that we can let them know what the resources are, what their options are, do all the things that Danielle had talked about earlier, which is find the allies, find the support that you may need. And when you're ready, and if you're ready to be unstuck, here's how we can help you at that point. But to force the issue is oftentimes going to be exceptionally counterproductive.
I love that, Ryan. I think that's great advice. I was going to go in a different, a different path there. But you're right. I think that they need to be able to find their timing. My original thought was to say, try not to hide from yourself, right? We know it happened, try not to hide from yourself. Because in these instances, most of the time we're taking on fault, right? The victim is taking on the fault when really it's not the victim's fault, right? And I think that we think that way. So, again, don't hide from yourself when you're ready. Like you said, Ryan, seek help, get the help that you need. And it's going to look different for every person. So you have to find your way to heal, but, you have to start somewhere. So really that's just understanding, what happened, admitting to yourself what happened, not hiding it, within yourself, because a lot of times that's what victims do. They go, oh, nope. Maybe I did it. It was my fault. It really didn't happen. I'm over exaggerating, and they take all of the blame. So I would really say, don't hide from yourself, find your truth.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that that you mentioned that healing can look different for everyone. Right. And so love that you brought up, counseling in the past as well. Absolutely. There's not just one way to go about this and healing this from sexual harassment. And so, yeah, there's definitely options. And I also appreciate, Ryan, too, you sharing that, everyone's there's no like timeline for healing, right? Everyone's kind of, when they're ready and at their pace, right? So we talked about, what the barriers are that survivors may face and the limitations, but what are some of the effects of sexual harassment? And are there ripple effects? Can it affect someone just at the work, or can it affect their whole life?
I think that sexual harassment can affect people in different ways. One is your health. So just a few things that can happen with your health. You can start getting headaches. With your financial situation, you may not want to go to work. productivity, you may decide that you really just don't want to be at work. You're avoiding places in the workplace. You don't want to go to the bathroom closest to a particular office, or you don't want to eat lunch with your coworkers anymore. You really begin to isolate yourself from the rest of the team. And all of these things will get to that point, which was your question. What were the ripple effects? So if you can't function in your workplace, in a normal fashion, it may create opportunities for depression and anxiety. And those are some big ones, in my opinion. And that looks different for every person. You may have difficulty sleeping. You may have difficulty communicating with others. There may be fear of, a particular sex or a particular type of person because of the experiences that you've had with sexual harassment. And I'm sure, Ryan probably has more, but those are just a few that have come to mind, things that I've had to deal with in my workplace.
I love that Danielle talked about the individual impact. That is not, when you asked that question, that's not where I was going with it. And so I really can appreciate what Danielle shared about that, because I was thinking from the organization. If you've got an organization or a culture that allows or turns away from addressing sexual harassment, that affects the morale of the department, of the organization or the industry. That affects retention. You'll see higher turnover, or people will not, just lower performance at work. You'll see things like eroding of trust in leadership, lack of communication. People will just shut down. And so all the things that Danielle had shared about for the individual, you'll start to see in that small, that organizational culture as well. It becomes normal. And so therefore people will start to act in a way that is normalized by that allowance of that behavior to continue.
Yeah, I can kind of see, like, it's almost like this wound that's like festering and it's spreading across the organization. And yeah, it could put people more at risk for harassment because, if it's just not addressed correctly, it's just basically excusing the behavior. So I appreciate you both like bringing specific examples and looking at it from a macro and a micro lens too. We talked a little bit about victim blaming and how often survivors may blame themselves even. I wanted to see if you had any other examples and kinds of victim blaming statements that survivors of harassment often face, or if you've seen any in your work with survivors or just in any kind of environment that you've been in.
I think with victim blaming, we see it very overt and then very subtly. I think the subtle oftentimes we see more often. Not to be redundant there, but I think that statements such as, well, what did you do to cause that? Really, what were you doing before they did this to you? Or one that I've heard pretty recently was, that surprises me. He does not sound like somebody who would do that. And so when you, that's a genuine response from that person, because the behavior that was reported was not anything that they've ever seen before. But to the person who reported that means, oh, somebody doesn't believe me, or maybe I have to second guess myself, or maybe I was wrong, or maybe I made that up. All the things that Danielle had talked about earlier. And then we often hear things, why didn't you tell somebody right away? This happened 2 months ago. If that were me, I would have, and then they fill in the blank. And so again, that reinforces the you've done something mentality to their complainant, as if they are somehow at fault for either the first behavior or not addressing it or allowing it to continue. And really to refocus that to say, what you did, you're not at fault for. You did nothing wrong. I believe you. Those types of statements are much more powerful. And that's why it's really important, to Danielle's point earlier, to find that ally, because sometimes the EO person, the HR person can't say those words. If we're in a place that we've got to investigate or look at that, although we may have beliefs or assumptions, we have to go based on the facts and the investigation that we do. And so the intuitive counselor, helper in many of us to say, I'm here for you, I believe you 100%, we can't say that. So it's really important that they find somebody who's in their corner, so to speak, who can say that to them, so they get that affirmation statement, especially if it cannot come from the person who's investigating at the moment. We may ultimately at the end say, yes, I did, but to do that prematurely impacts the investigation.
Such a good point. And I think it's kind of showing how it's so important how vital supporters are to survivors. So again, you could be the first person that this person is sharing this with. And so the way that you respond, of course, if you're not in a situation like you were mentioning, Ryan, where that would put a risk to the investigation. But if you're just like a friend or a supporter or a loved one, the way that you respond to how someone discloses can really impact their healing journey. A lot of times we've heard from clients that even the trauma itself was, of course, impactful. Sometimes what the survivor is coming forward to process and help with healing is the things that happened after, the way that people responded to it too. And so it just kind of shows how vital supporters are when it comes to things like sexual harassment. Danielle, I didn't know if you had anything that you wanted to jump in on as far as things that you've seen as far as victim blaming statements before we move forward.
I would say, going back to what Ryan said about the culture, just ensuring that we keep the morale high, because when it's not, the blaming comes from, oh, this is just how the environment is. Oh, you liked it. We were all joking, oh no, you like the attention. And it's more along the lines of, that's just how this environment is. And so a person is supposed to take on all of that and again get blamed for what's happening because they don't agree with what's happening, because they feel differently from what others feel in that environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that those are all so important to kind of going back to those myths where like no one deserves harassment. No job in their job description says must endure harassment. It should not be normalized. And kind of that idea of the culture normalizing it is so detrimental. I'd like to shift gears a little bit here to more of success stories. So, with your work with survivors or individuals, do you have any success stories that you'd like to share?
My success story isn't with an individual, but it would be from a cultural perspective. I would say, as a corporate trainer, actually getting the message to employees early on has probably been the most beneficial thing that any of the agencies that I've worked for could have done. Because what you do is you set a precedent for what is expected of your employees right when they come through the door. Right. This is the environment. This is what we are expecting. These are the things that we have no tolerance for. So being able to do that has been rewarding for me. And ideally, it's helped with the culture in general of like I said, many of the places that I've had the opportunity to get the employees oriented into. So I would say that's the biggest success story. Anything that a company can do to really get that message out early. I mean, it's nice to do it, right? To be reactive. Oh, something happened. Let's make sure that everyone knows. But getting it out early and just really making sure that people understand where the agency, the company stands. That's incredible. I think that really helps.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, Danielle. I think that that's a great success story to share. I think sometimes silence can speak really loudly, right? So setting the precedence of this is what we do not tolerate and we will protect our survivors is so incredibly, I would feel very safe and secure working there. And yeah, I can see how that would absolutely shift the culture. Ryan, I don't know if you had any success stories that you had that you wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with Danielle. I'm thinking of training and introducing this topic to individuals who may have talked about it before, listened to it, or really zoned out when they went through the the formal HR training that they've taken at another place that they've worked, and really had an impact and helped individuals to think differently and hopefully therefore behave differently. I think when we're talking about success stories, I don't know, I'm immediately hesitant to say or share success stories as if it were to give off the impression that we have claimed victory over this topic. And I don't want to take away from thinking about to say, yes, we're successful at either this place I work or a place that I've worked before, because we have not completely eliminated it. And there will always be somebody who will say, yeah, but what about me? Or what about my set of circumstances? So I think I look to how do we measure success? And I think we measure success at changing the culture, to Danielle's point, is are we talking about this as a culture? What are our expectations as a culture and as an organization? How are we formalizing that training? At what levels in the organization? And really, when we think about it, how are we creating a culture where people can speak up and step up? So it's not just it's finding your voice conversation before, which is essential. We want people to be able to find their voice and speak up. But for a number of reasons, if they don't, what about the other people who are around them, their coworkers? Are they speaking up on their behalf? And to create a culture where people step in is really, I think, a benchmark for success, to make sure that there's that shared responsibility for this. Although it may not be affecting me directly, I can see that it's impacting my friend or coworker, and so I'm going to say something as a result.
I love that, and that really leads to kind of my one of my final questions here, which is, how do we help end it? So it sounds like what we can do is kind of shifting that culture. I know that you mentioned the trainings, and you mentioning talking more about it and having those safer work environments and those expectations. Is there anything else that needs to be done, or things that we can do maybe at home, or anyone that we can do to help shift this culture?
I think from a formal culture, what I would hope that the businesses, companies, organizations do is to set those clear consequences. I think we've talked a lot for the past hour together about really what people should be doing and expecting people to behave in the way that humans should be, which is respectful, and knowing that there will be people who don't. And so for there to be clear consequences for those individuals that are agreed upon, that are stated, and that are followed through from the organization. It sends that message. It's a deterrent. It should not be the only way. I think some companies or organizations feel that is the solution, which is, well, we're going to have a policy of no tolerance, and therefore that's all we need to do. When in actuality, that's an element to the solution. It's not the solution. And then at the same time, to also address the microaggressions, the behaviors that lead up to that. Oftentimes, people who sexually harass other people have engaged in behaviors that were probably boundary setting before, to say, let me try this, see what I can get away with, maybe with another person. And so stopping that behavior at the start before it becomes a snowball effect is really essential to do. And so in addition to when you had asked Emilie about what people can do at home, is really to start these conversations. If the conversations aren't happening at a system level, to engage in those conversations, to learn more, and to make it part of the culture, because really a top-down or bottom-up approach traditionally that we hear about in these types of things does not work on its own. It has to be both. So really to figure out how they can affect and implement change.
I love that. I love all of that information that you shared. Super vital. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's so much that needs to be done. And I appreciate you bringing up that, yeah, we talked about let's expect respect, but also we do need to hold people accountable because we have to know that people may not, follow those guidelines and things like that. So holding accountability and things like that. And I love the idea of course, the top and the, top down and, grassroots, or however you want to point it out, it has to come from all sides in order to finally see this shift. Danielle, I don't know if there was anything else that you wanted to hop in on as far as what needs to be done to help end harassment.
I would just reiterate what you guys said. Keep the conversation going, right? Keep the conversation going, set the expectations, and then make sure that those who are involved are held accountable for their actions.
Definitely. And I think that that's a great place to kind of sign up. Before I do, just wanted to check, what are some of those resources that you would like to share for people who may be experiencing sexual harassment? I know that we talked a little bit about the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Are there any other resources that you wanted to share?
I think in addition to the EEOC, there's oftentimes local agencies, depending on the municipality or where the person lives or works, that they may want to look at from a policy and legal perspective. Because I work in a college setting, I think the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education is a great resource for individuals as well. There's another layer of expectation and protection for students and employees that work at a K through 12 or higher education institution. And then I think for resources that are not the policy, but just the support, thinking back to, again, what Danielle was sharing about the counselor, the EAP, there's RAINN, RAINN.org, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, and WomenAgainstAbuse.org. Both have specific information about workplace sexual harassment that I think is helpful for individuals who may be trying to figure out what are the options available to them.
I think that that's absolutely wonderful. And knowing that there are options and that you're not stuck, and there's so many different ways and people out there ready to support you. And I love, again, bringing up like the counseling services too. There's not just one way to heal. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you'd like to say that we may not have addressed before we sign off? Or is there anything that you'd like to say to the survivors out there who may have experienced harassment?
I think we've covered a lot in our time together, so I don't think that there's anything else to share. But to your second point, which is to the survivors, just to acknowledge their bravery in speaking up, and to hopefully indicate to those who have yet to speak up or are choosing not to, that there are resources, there are people who will listen, and to really encourage that, and to individuals who are listening who are not engaging in that behavior, but this is an important topic to them, to really take that ownership and to take the steps to influence your own culture at your place of work. Because as we talked about, the ripple effect is pretty profound, and we would really encourage you to speak up when you're able to.
I love that. Danielle, I don't know if there's anything you want to hop in on before we sign off.
I would have to keep it very simple and let all victims know you are not to blame.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. To everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Ryan and Danielle, for joining me today.
Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.